Let's take a detailed look at knitting the sock heels and toes using a circular sock machine. The two are knitted just alike. First, a look at the tension spring, otherwise known as the heel spring. This is our normal threading pattern, bypassing that spring completely. Because heels and toes are worked going opposite directions on alternate rows, when the carrier changes direction, slack would develop in the yarn and potentially cause drop stitches or an overly large stitches. So we engage the heel spring like this. That removes the extra yarn that might develop at the beginning and ending of rows as we change direction and solves the problem. It is actually possible to work toes and heels without a heel spring. I was doing that in the first two movies on hem top socks because mine wasn't working right, and you can see how to cope. If your heel spring is in poor condition, Jack's movie on fixing it might be helpful to you. This is always done on half of the total needles. I'll be using the group closest to me, so I'm placing those farthest from me into hold. Hold is all the way up on a circular sock machine. The yarn carrier is now here, and when I knit around to the first held needle, that is actually going to be the first row of the heel, the first short row. We now want to pull this needle, the last one that knitted, into hold. I've already snipped the yarn that was for the leg because I'm knitting Franken socks this time and changing colors for the heel. So you get to see how that's done. We need to thread the yarn for the heel color in the normal way through the mast and then through the yarn carrier. And we need to set it up so it will be able to start knitting exactly at the first needle that it needs to. Because of having two loose yarn tails, this is not a piece of cake. You may have to tease the new working yarn into the hook and hold it there while you turn the crank with your other hand. It's absolutely critical that every needle catches the yarn and knits. Otherwise, we'll have a hole, and of course, holes run. While short rowing in, the first half of the short rows, at the end of each one of them, we will take the last needle that knitted and pull it up into hold. Short rowing is designed to create a pocket of fabric. It will form here to create the heel or the toe, and that's exactly what we want. However, the machine is not a fan of knitting stitches that are not pulled down, so we need to add some sock weights of some kind. I'm using the heavy forks from my book, Cheap Tricks and Cool Tools. I use 3 of them, and I move them frequently to keep them pulling down on the fabric where the pull is needed to keep downward pressure on all of the needles so as not to have any stitches jump off. While knitting the tubular portions of the sock, we knit round and round, cranking in the same direction. While knitting the heel, we crank in opposite directions for every alternate row. I usually knit 4 rows, sometimes I can get by with 6, and then I move the weights back to their optimal position. It's pretty important to get the yarn carrier to the middle of the group of held needles. Otherwise, you will have happen what I just did. I didn't really pass the last needle by enough, and when I reversed to correct the matter, it caused a stitch not to knit off. So what you just saw was me knitting it off manually, but I could have avoided all that woe had I been more careful about getting all the way around to the back. It does not help that these loose tails allow the stitches to elongate. So although we don't want knots in the sock, I may tighten that stitch up temporarily by tying the ends together. As always, place the last needle that knitted into hold by bringing it all the way up. Rotate the opposite direction, knit around, and bring the last needle into hold. Now, about the number of times we do this, it's going to vary with the size of the cylinder. We work on half of the needles. This is a 72 stitch cylinder. You can see that I've decided it's time to move the weights. So on a 72 stitch cylinder, we work on 36 needles for the heel, gradually short rowing in 35, 4, 3, and so on until after we place the last needle in hold, there are only 12 in work. On a 60 stitch cylinder, we work on 30 needles and short row in until after the last stitch goes into hold. There are only 10 in work. For other sizes of cylinder, you always still work on half of the total of the needles and short row down until a third of that half remain in work. If there's not a perfect third, decide based on the shape of the foot whether you want a more pronounced heel by short rowing in a little past a third of the needles or one or two less than a third. The last needle is going into hold now, and on this row before knitting back, we place the held needle that's on the side away from the yarn carrier back into work. And at this point, you almost always ought to move the weights up for safety. From this point on, before knitting each row, one needle on the side away from the yarn carrier gets pushed back down into working position. While short rowing out, as the rows get longer, I don't find I have to change the position of the weights quite as frequently, but still watch and do change frequently. It's a difference between about every 4 rows on the way in for me and every 6 rows on the way out. It's important to be aware that by the age that most sock machines are at present, they have a character all their own. Plus, the different models and brands always did have variable characters. So you need to pay close attention to what works well for your individual machine. Anything that I or anyone else tells you is a starting place that works for us. And you need to get to know your machine as your buddy and figure out what works for you and it in tandem. If you forget to place a needle back in work, as I am doing right this minute, it's not the end of the world. You can hand knit the stitch. Unseat the needle from its spot, tip it back, grab the yarn that should have gone into it, and pull it through. At this point, we resume knitting in the round. I'm changing yarn colors. That's only necessary if you're knitting contrasting heels. Do leave the sock weights on for a while because the main weight is still not pulling down that area.